Hello and welcome back to Nightfall Lore. Tonight we're going somewhere most hunters never reach. Not a street, not a cathedral, not a moonlit rooftop, but a chamber buried so far beneath the waking city that almost no one who enters it ever speaks of what they found. We're going to look for the woman an entire city was named after. Not a saint, not a scholar, a queen, ancient beyond telling, who gave Yharnam her name and then vanished so completely from its history that most of its citizens walking the cobblestones above her have no idea she exists at all. This is the story of Queen Yharnam, Pthumerian by blood, mother by a union no human language has ever been built to describe, and prisoner in the very civilization that bears her name. It is a story built from fragments, item descriptions half a sentence long, a boss fight buried at the bottom of a labyrinth most players never finish, a name repeated so often across the game that nobody stops to ask why it belongs to a person we almost never see. Tonight we will ask that question slowly, carefully, and all the way to the end. If you are settling in for the night, getting comfortable somewhere quiet, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from. Drop it in the comments whenever you get the chance. There is something nice about knowing how far these stories travel while you drift off. For now, let yourself sink into the mattress, dim the light if you have not already, and let's walk together into the dark beneath Yharnam. Every city in Bloodborne carries the weight of its own history somewhere in its name, but Yharnam is unusual in how literally that weight is carried. The city is not named for a saint, a founding family, or a geographic feature the way so many real cities are. It is named, as directly as the game's fragmented lore allows us to determine, for a woman. A queen. One whose existence the game barely acknowledges in its main story, and instead buries deep within its most punishing optional content, the Chalice dungeons, as though the truth of her were something the developers themselves wanted hidden behind locks within locks. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how unusual it is for Bloodborne to name anything after a person at all. The Healing Church does not bear the name of its founder. Bergenwerth does not carry the name of the scholar who built it. Cainhurst is named for its bloodline, not an individual. Against this pattern, a city named directly after a single woman stands out immediately once you notice it. It suggests that whoever she was, her significance was not incidental. It was foundational. The city did not simply happen to be built near where she once stood. In some sense, the game seems to suggest the city was built around her, in the same way a settlement might be built around a well, or a shrine, or a grave. We meet her, if we meet her at all, only through the path of Chalice dungeons, specifically through the labyrinth built around Pthumeru and its deepest variant, accessed by players willing to descend through randomised layers of stone corridors and forgotten architecture that exist almost entirely outside the narrative players experience on the surface. She appears as a boss, chained, kneeling, waiting in a chamber that feels less like a throne room and more like a cell that someone centuries ago dressed up to look like reverence. This contradiction, a queen presented in chains, a namesake hidden at the absolute bottom of the game's most obscure content, is the first and perhaps most important clue to who she really was and what was actually done to her. A queen who is celebrated does not need to be imprisoned. A queen who is imprisoned and still has a city built in her name was likely something far more complicated than royalty in the way we typically imagine it. She may have been worshipped and feared at the same time. She may have been the literal source of something the city could not survive without, and could not bear to look at directly. Holding both of those truths at once, reverence and fear, gratitude and erasure, is the only honest way to begin understanding who she actually was. We will spend the rest of tonight's journey trying to understand what that something was. But the foundation has to be laid carefully, because Bloodborne does not explain Queen Yharnam the way it explains, say, Gehrman or Father Gascoigne. There is no quest line. There is no NPC dialogue walking you through her history. There is only the architecture she's buried beneath, the creature she shares her chamber with, and the handful of item descriptions that mention her by name. Piecing together her story means treating those fragments the way an archaeologist treats potsherds. Each one small, each one incomplete, but together capable of suggesting the shape of something much larger. What we know for certain is this: she predates the city as we understand it. She's tied inseparably to the Pthumerian civilization, an ancient society that existed long before Yharnam's cobblestones were laid. A civilization that worshipped beings the game calls Great Ones, and built much of its architecture and ritual life around making contact with them. And she is, in some capacity the game refuses to state outright, but strongly implies, a mother. Not metaphorically, not in the sense of being a mother to her people, the way monarchs are sometimes described. Literally. There is a child connected to her, and that child's story is in many ways even darker than her own. Tonight we begin at the surface, with the city that bears her name, and we will work our way down, through the Pthumerian ruins beneath it, through the discovery that changed Yharnam forever, through the captivity that defined her fate, and finally into the chamber where hunters eventually find her, kneeling in chains, waiting for an ending she may have been waiting for since long before any of us were born. Notice just how easy it is to miss her entirely. A hunter could complete the full main story of Bloodborne, witness every ending the surface narrative offers, and never once hear the words Queen Yharnam spoken aloud, never once see her name written on a single piece of surface world text. She exists almost entirely outside the path most players walk. You have to choose, deliberately and repeatedly, to leave the comfort of the main story and descend into procedurally generated dungeons that offer no narrative reward beyond loot and difficulty, simply because something in you wants to know what's actually down there. The game does not pull you toward her. It waits, patiently, for you to go looking. This says something about how From Software chose to handle her significance. A more conventional piece of storytelling might have built an entire subplot around uncovering a city's namesake, complete with quest markers and dialogue prompts nudging players toward the revelation. Bloodborne does the opposite. It treats her like a secret the world itself is trying to keep, accessible only to those willing to do the work of digging through architecture nobody required them to enter. In a strange way, this design choice mirrors her own story perfectly. Buried, optional, easy to walk past entirely, and yet absolutely foundational to everything happening above her, whether anyone chooses to acknowledge it or not. This design philosophy deserves a kind of respect of its own, even as we sit with how much it asks of anyone hoping to understand the full picture. Most games tell you what matters. Bloodborne, time and again, trusts players to decide that for themselves, scattering its deepest truths across the kind of optional, punishing content that filters out anyone unwilling to put in real effort. Queen Yharnam's story exists in this sense, as a kind of reward reserved specifically for patience and curiosity, not a twist meant to shock casual players, but a slow, quiet revelation meant for those willing to keep digging long after the main story has already given them every reasonable excuse to stop. With all of that said, let's finally go meet her properly. Not the rushed, surface-level summary so many lore videos settle for, but the full, slow walk through everything that made her who she became, the civilization that shaped her, the act that transformed her, the captivity that defined her, and the child whose story can never quite be separated from her own. Settle in. We have a long way to go before we reach that chamber at the bottom of the labyrinth, and there's no reason to rush any part of the path that gets us there. We start, as any story like this one should, with the civilization that made her, and made the very idea of someone like her possible in the first place. Long before the spires of the Healing Church rose above Yharnam's rooftops, before Gehrman ever swore his hunter's oath, before the very concept of old blood entered human history, there was Pthumeru. The game gives us only glimpses of this civilization, but those glimpses are consistent and unsettling in what they imply. Pthumeru was not a primitive society stumbled upon by Byrgenwerth scholars. It was, by every indication, advanced, architecturally sophisticated, ritually complex, and deeply, intentionally oriented around contact with beings beyond ordinary human comprehension. The Pthumerians built downward rather than outward. Where most civilizations expand across a landscape, Pthumeru appears to have tunnelled into the earth, carving labyrinths that descend in layers, each one more elaborate and more dangerous than the last. This is not architecture built for daily living in any way we would recognise. It is architecture built for something else entirely. Containment, ritual, worship, or perhaps all three simultaneously. The chalice dungeons that players explore today are, by implication, remnants and recreations of this original labyrinth structure, summoned back into existence through ritual rather than literally excavated. What were they trying to contain, or reach, or worship? The game's answer, consistent across nearly every fragment of lore connected to Pthumeru, is the Great Ones. These are beings that exist largely outside human perception, vast and incomprehensible, the kind of entities whose mere presence can unravel a mind not prepared to encounter them. The Pthumerians, unlike the Healing Church scholars who would later stumble onto similar truth through Byrgenwerth, seem to have approached these beings not with scientific curiosity, but with something closer to devotion, religious structures, sacrificial patterns, an entire society organised around the project of making contact. This is the civilization Queen Yharnam ruled, or at minimum belonged to at the highest level. Her title, Pthumerian Queen, places her not at the edges of this society but at its absolute centre. If Pthumeru's defining project was communion with the Great Ones, then a queen within that society was almost certainly not a passive ceremonial figure. She would have been central to that project in ways that, as we will see, likely cost her everything a normal life might have offered. The labyrinths the Pthumerians built were not abandoned by accident or natural decline. Something happened to this civilization. The game never tells us precisely what, but the evidence scattered throughout the Chalice dungeons suggests catastrophe rather than gradual fading. Skeletal remains in unusual configurations. Architecture that seems frozen mid-ritual, as though whatever was happening when the civilization ended was never finished. Creatures that still patrol these depths, twisted descendants or remnants of the Pthumerian people themselves, transformed by the very things they once sought to contact. It is into this collapse, or perhaps at the heart of whatever event caused it, that Queen Yharnam's story is anchored. She's not merely a ruler whose civilization later fell into ruin around her. The implications scattered through item descriptions suggest she was directly, personally involved in the events that ended Pthumeru as a functioning society. Events connected to communion with a Great One so significant that its consequences echoed for centuries afterward, eventually shaping the city built above her tomb. There is something worth sitting with here, in the quiet of this chapter, before we move forward. The Pthumerians sought contact with beings beyond comprehension, and in some sense they succeeded. Succeeded so completely that the contact itself became unsustainable, became something that needed to be buried, locked away, transformed into labyrinth and ritual and silence. Civilizations that reach too far do not always fall through war or famine. Sometimes they fall because they got exactly what they were looking for, and what they were looking for was never meant to be held. Queen Yharnam, whoever she truly was before the title, before the chains, before the centuries of waiting in the dark beneath a city that would eventually rise and take her name without ever truly knowing her, she stood at the centre of that reaching, and the price of that position, as we're about to see, was almost unimaginable. Picture, for a moment, what kind of civilization could produce a leader willing to occupy that kind of position in the first place? Pthumeru, by every architectural and ritual indication scattered through the Chalice dungeons, was not a society that stumbled accidentally into contact with the Great Ones. It was a society that organised itself, generation after generation, around the deliberate pursuit of that contact, refining its methods, building its labyrinths deeper and more elaborate with each iteration, treating communion not as a distant aspiration but as an achievable, structured goal. A queen raised within that kind of culture would have understood, likely from a very young age, that her position carried obligations far beyond the conventional duties of rulership. This context matters because it complicates any reading of Queen Yharnam as a purely passive victim swept up by forces entirely beyond her understanding. She was raised within, and very possibly helped shape, a civilization whose entire identity was built around the pursuit she eventually undertook. Whatever choice she made, if choice is even the right word for decisions made within a culture that may have offered her no real alternative, was made by someone who had spent her whole life inside a society pointed unwaveringly toward this exact kind of reaching. Understanding her tragedy means holding both truths at once, that she may have approached communion with genuine conviction, shaped by everything Pthumeru had taught her to believe, and that the consequences of that conviction were still far beyond anything any single person, however prepared, could reasonably be expected to bear. This tension between conviction and consequence runs through nearly every piece of Pthumerian architecture players encounter throughout the Chalice dungeons. The labyrinths are not built haphazardly. They show clear evidence of careful, deliberate design, refined and rebuilt across what appears to be multiple generations, each iteration seemingly more focused, more precise in its ritual purpose than the last. This is the architecture of a civilization that believed deeply in what it was doing, that treated its pursuit of the Great Ones not as reckless experimentation, but as a sacred generational project worth dedicating enormous resources and effort toward perfecting. A queen, emerging from the absolute peak of that kind of devoted multi-generational effort, would have carried not just personal conviction, but the accumulated weight of everyone who came before her, all of them building toward the same eventual moment of contact she would ultimately be the one to complete. A particular kind of pressure comes with being the one chosen, or perhaps born into the position, to finally complete a project that generations before you only prepared the ground for. Every ancestor who refined the labyrinth's design, every scholar-priest who developed the rituals she would eventually carry out, every failed or incomplete attempt that came before her, all of it would have existed as a kind of inheritance she alone was left to carry forward to its conclusion. This is a particular, crushing kind of historical weight, different from simply being unlucky enough to encounter something dangerous. It is the weight of being the culmination, the living endpoint of an ambition too large for any single generation to complete alone, finally arriving at the one person whose body and circumstance happened to align with the moment everything was ready. To understand how Queen Yharnam's story connects to the city above her, we have to talk about blood, specifically the old blood, the substance that defines nearly every aspect of Bloodborne's world. The Healing Church's blood ministration, the transformation of ordinary citizens into beasts, the hunters, the choir, the experiments at Byrgenwerth. All of it traces back to the discovery of a particular kind of blood, ancient and powerful beyond ordinary human biology, found deep beneath the earth in the ruins of Pthumeru. The scholars of Byrgenwerth, led by figures whose names are far more familiar to most hunters, Lawrence, Willem, Gehrman, among the early hunters who served them, did not invent the old blood. They found it, discovered it within the Pthumerian labyrinth during their early explorations of what would later become the Chalice dungeons, a labyrinth built by a civilization that had vanished long before, leaving behind ruins, remnants, and, crucially, this blood. Where did this blood come from? This is one of the central unanswered questions of Bloodborne's lore, and Queen Yharnam sits directly at the centre of every plausible theory. The old blood is described across multiple sources within the game as connected intimately to the Great Ones, a substance of cosmic origin rather than purely biological human origin, something that grants power and insight precisely because it carries within it a trace of beings that exist beyond normal human perception. Blood, in Bloodborne's cosmology, is not just bodily fluid, it is a conduit, a bridge between human flesh and something vastly larger. If the old blood is connected to the Great Ones, and Queen Yharnam was, as we explored in the previous chapter, intimately connected to Pthumeru's project of communion with those same beings, then the implication becomes difficult to avoid. The blood that built the Healing Church, that powers blood ministration, that eventually transforms ordinary citizens of Yharnam into ravening beasts under the full moon, this blood may trace back in some essential way to her, not metaphorically as a symbol of royal lineage, but literally as the source the Byrgenwerth scholars found and harvested when they breached the depths of the Pthumerian labyrinth and discovered whatever, or whoever, was waiting there. This reframes everything about the city's relationship to its own namesake. Yharnam is not named after a queen the way a city might be named after a beloved ruler from its own founding. Yharnam may be named after the literal wellspring of everything the city became, its medicine, its religion, its curse, its eventual ruin during the night of the hunt. The scholars who found the old blood beneath Pthumeru did not simply discover a resource. If the theory holds, they discovered a person, an ancient queen who had become something far stranger than human through her civilization's pursuit of the Great Ones, and they built an entire society on top of what they took from her. This is, if true, one of the darker undercurrents running beneath all of Bloodborne's surface story. The disease that ravages Yharnam during the hunt, the beasts that prowl its streets, the madness that claims its scholars, all of it can be traced back, link by link, to blood drawn from a woman who was likely never asked, never consulted, and never freed. The city above literally feeds on what was taken from the queen buried beneath it, and in its centuries of forgetting her, has never once reckoned with the cost of that theft. There is a kind of quiet horror in sitting with this idea as the night goes on. Civilization that vanishes, leaving behind a queen, and a substance that outlives it by centuries. Scholars who find that substance and build an empire from it, without ever fully understanding what, or who, they had found. A city that takes a name without remembering, or perhaps choosing not to remember, what that name actually cost. We're going to keep moving deeper into this question, but let's allow this to settle for a moment first, the way the truth itself seems to settle at the bottom of every layer of Pthumeru's ruins. waiting patiently for someone willing to dig far enough to find it. Picture what it must have meant for those first Byrgenwerth scholars in the moment of discovery itself. They were not, by most accounts of their early scholarly mission, expecting to find anything resembling a living being at the bottom of the ruins they explored. They were searching for knowledge, for artifacts, for whatever insight a vanished civilization might offer about the nature of existence beyond ordinary human limits. What they likely found instead, if the theory holds, was something far stranger and far more morally complicated than an artifact or a text. A being who had once ruled an entire civilization, transformed beyond easy categorization, still present, still in some sense alive, at the absolute bottom of the labyrinth. How does a scholar process a discovery like that? The historical record, fragmented as it is, suggests they did not pause for long to grapple with the ethical weight of what they had found. The pursuit of knowledge at Byrgenwerth was already, even in its earliest years, oriented toward extraction rather than reciprocity, toward taking what could be learned or harvested rather than building any kind of relationship with what they encountered. Queen Yharnam, whatever she had become through her communion, was treated from nearly the first moment of discovery as a resource to be studied and drawn from, rather than a being whose transformation deserved careful, considered understanding before any further action was taken. This pattern, established in that very first encounter, would go on to define the entire relationship between the city and its namesake for centuries to come. Think for a moment about what this means for every ordinary citizen who has ever received blood ministration within the walls of the healing church. Every transfusion, every vial of old blood administered as medicine, as comfort, as the promise of healing in a world without modern medical understanding. None of those citizens would have had any reason to ask where the blood originated, any more than someone receiving a vaccine today pauses to trace its manufacturing supply chain back to its earliest source. The blood simply existed, available, effective, woven into the fabric of how the city cared for its sick and its dying. And yet, if the theory we've been building tonight holds, every single one of those quiet, ordinary moments of healing carries within it some trace of what was taken from a queen who never consented to any of it. The mundane and the monstrous, intertwined so completely that centuries of citizens lived and died, never once suspecting the connection. It's a strange thing to sit with, this idea that an act of healing and an act of harm can share the exact same origin point without anyone involved ever recognizing the contradiction. But perhaps that's simply how foundational costs work in any civilization, fictional or otherwise, buried deep enough beneath everyday function that the people benefiting from them never have reason to ask where the benefit actually came from, until someone, centuries later, finally goes looking. Before she became chains and silence at the bottom of a labyrinth, Queen Yharnam was, by every implication the game offers, a figure of real authority within Pthumerian society. Not a passive vessel waiting to be discovered, but a ruler whose position placed her at the intersection of her civilization's politics, its religion, and its ultimate ambitions toward the Great Ones. Understanding her as a queen, in the fuller sense of that word, matters because it reframes everything that happens to her afterward, not as the passive suffering of a victim alone, but as the fall of someone who once held genuine power and lost it through forces larger than any single person. Pthumerian society, as we've discussed, was built around contact with beings beyond ordinary comprehension. In a civilization organised this completely around a single religious and scientific project, the figure at its political apex would almost certainly have been deeply entangled with that project's most significant undertakings. A queen in Pthumeru was not likely a figurehead presiding over harvests and trade disputes, the way a more conventional medieval ruler might be. Her role, if the architecture and ritual remnants scattered throughout the Chalice dungeons are any indication, would have placed her near the absolute centre of the civilization's defining act, the pursuit of communion with a Great One. This matters enormously for how we understand what eventually happened to her. If Queen Yharnam had simply been an ordinary subject of Pthumeru swept up in catastrophe, her story would be tragic in a more conventional sense, an innocent caught in events beyond her control. But the evidence suggests something more layered. She may have actively pursued, or at minimum knowingly participated in, the very ritual that eventually consumed her. This does not make what happened to her any less devastating. If anything, it deepens the tragedy, because it suggests a woman who reached toward something vast and transformative, believing, as her entire civilization believed, that the reaching itself was worth almost any cost, only to discover that the cost was not hers alone to pay. A pattern recurs across Bloodborne's lore that's worth naming here. The line between worshipper and sacrifice is almost never clean. Lawrence sought knowledge and became a flaming, mindless horror. The choir pursued evolution and became withered remnants of themselves, kept alive by artificial means. Across nearly every example the game offers, the people who reach hardest toward the Great Ones are transformed by that reaching in ways they never anticipated and could never fully consent to, because the scale of what they're reaching toward is simply incompatible with human understanding of consequence. Queen Yharnam likely represents the oldest and most foundational example of this pattern in the game's entire timeline. Centuries before Lawrence ever burned, centuries before the choir hollowed itself out chasing evolution, a Pthumerian queen reached toward a Great One and was transformed by what answered. Everything that follows in Bloodborne's history, the healing church, the hunters, the beasts, the entire architecture of blood ministration built on top of what Byrgenwerth's scholars eventually found beneath the earth, exists in some sense as an echo of what happened to her first. This is part of why her current state, chained and kneeling in a chamber at the bottom of the Chalice dungeons, carries such weight once you understand the fuller context. She is not simply imprisoned. She is, in a very real sense, the original template for every tragedy the game's surface story explores. The hunters chasing beasts through Yharnam's streets are dealing with the latest iteration of a pattern that began with her, in a labyrinth far below their feet, long before any of them were born. Understanding her as a queen, someone who once held genuine authority and made genuine choices, however constrained by the beliefs of her civilization, makes what comes next, the loss of that authority, the transformation into something her own people may have eventually feared, all the more difficult to sit with. We turn now to the act that defined her fate more than any other, the communion itself, the moment Pthumeru's queen reached toward a Great One and the world she ruled was never the same again. But before we follow her into that moment, consider what kind of pressures a ruler, in her position, might have carried that an ordinary subject never would. If Pthumerian society judged its leaders in part by their closeness to successful communion, then Queen Yharnam may have faced expectations no different in kind, if vastly different in scale, from the pressures any monarch faces to secure their lineage, defend their borders, or maintain their legitimacy. For her, legitimacy itself may have been tied directly to proximity to the Great Ones, meaning the ritual we're about to examine was not simply a personal spiritual pursuit, but very possibly an act bound up with the survival and authority of her entire reign. This adds another layer to the tragedy that's easy to overlook, if we only think of her communion as an isolated, almost accidental event. If her position as queen depended even in part on her willingness to pursue contact more directly and more completely than anyone before her, then she may have approached this moment not with the freedom of someone acting purely from personal conviction, but with the weight of an entire civilization's expectations resting on the outcome. Whatever bravery, desperation, or genuine devotion drove her forward, it was almost certainly entangled with obligations she had little real power to refuse, even as the one wearing the crown. A useful parallel exists in how power and obligation intertwine in nearly every monarchy throughout history, fictional or otherwise. Crowns rarely come without strings attached, and the higher the position, the tighter those strings tend to be pulled. A queen of an ordinary kingdom might be expected to marry strategically, to produce heirs, to maintain alliances through careful diplomacy. A queen of Pthumeru, ruling a civilization whose entire identity revolved around contact with beings beyond human comprehension, would have faced an analogous set of expectations, just scaled to match the civilization's singular, all-consuming ambition. She did not simply rule a kingdom. She stood as the living embodiment of everything her people had spent generations working toward, which means her eventual communion was likely never framed, even to herself, as purely optional. It was simply what queens of Pthumeru, at the height of their reign, were ultimately expected to attempt. The central defining event of Queen Yharnam's story, the one the game gestures toward without ever stating outright, scattered across item descriptions and the visual design of her boss encounter, is her communion with a Great One. This is the moment everything else in her story radiates outward from. Her transformation, her captivity, the old blood eventually harvested from Pthumeru's ruins, the very existence of a child whose cries echo through one of the game's most haunting late-game areas. All of it traces back to this single, almost unspeakable act. What exactly does communion with a Great One mean in Bloodborne's cosmology? The game is deliberately vague, but the pattern across multiple examples gives us a working understanding. A Great One is a being whose nature exists largely outside ordinary human perception. Vast, ancient, operating according to logic and purpose that human minds were never built to fully comprehend. Contact with such a being is never depicted as a simple meeting. It is described again and again in terms closer to possession, transformation, or consumption. Something of the human is changed, often irreversibly, by even brief proximity to a Great One's true nature. For Queen Yharnam, as ruler of a civilization whose entire purpose was oriented toward exactly this kind of contact, communion was likely not an accident or an isolated incident. It was, in all probability, the culmination of generations of Pthumerian ritual and belief. The moment the civilization's defining project finally succeeded, or at least appeared to succeed, in the most direct and personal way imaginable. Their queen did not simply study the Great Ones from a respectful distance the way later healing church scholars would attempt. She made contact directly, and that contact appears to have resulted in something her civilization had perhaps not fully prepared for, no matter how long they had sought it. The boss encounter players eventually faced deep within the Chalice dungeons reflects this transformation directly. Queen Yharnam's design in that fight is not simply that of a captive human queen. Her later phases reveal something far stranger. Small, spider-like creatures that emerge from her form, a presence that feels less like a single combatant and more like a vessel containing something that should not be looked at too directly. This is not incidental creature design. It is the game's visual language confirming what the item descriptions only imply. Communion changed her at a fundamental level, transforming Pthumeru's queen into something that exists at the boundary between human and Great One, no longer entirely either. a recurring detail in Bloodborne's broader lore becomes relevant here. The idea that Great Ones are often associated with motherhood, with offspring, with the act of giving birth to something not quite human. The moon presence. The various Great Ones tied to specific children or infant-like forms scattered throughout the game's late content. This pattern strongly suggests that communion in Bloodborne's cosmology is frequently tied to conception, that contact between a human and a Great One can result not just in transformation of the human, but in literal offspring, beings that are neither fully human nor fully Great One, existing in an unsettling space between. If this pattern holds for Queen Yharnam, and the evidence strongly suggests it does, then her communion with a Great One did not end with her own transformation. It resulted in a child, and that child, known throughout the game's late areas as Mergo, would go on to become one of the central, most haunting mysteries of Bloodborne's entire narrative, an infant whose cries can be heard echoing through the hunter's nightmare, watched over by a guardian whose grief is rendered in some of the most devastating environmental storytelling the game ever attempts. We will spend the next chapter with Mergo directly. But before we move forward, let's pause on what this chapter has established. Queen Yharnam reached towards something vast, in keeping with everything her civilization had built itself around for generations. And in that reaching, she became something new, neither fully the queen she had been, nor fully whatever the Great One she touched truly was. Caught permanently between two states of being, a result her own city would eventually be built upon without ever understanding what that in-between state had cost her. There's also the physical reality of what communion likely meant for her body to sit with, separate from the broader civilizational and cosmological implications we've already discussed. Bloodborne consistently depicts contact with Great Ones as something that registers physically as much as spiritually. Bodies reshaped, blood altered at a fundamental level, the boundaries of ordinary human anatomy stretched or broken entirely by what passes through them. Whatever Queen Yharnam looked like before her communion, whatever she felt as it happened, the game's visual language during her eventual boss encounter suggests the change was neither quick nor gentle. It reads as something that unfolded across time, layer by layer, her body becoming host to a presence it was never built to hold. Imagine, for a moment, what those early days or months after communion might have felt like for her, assuming she retained enough of her original consciousness to feel anything at all in any way we'd recognise. A queen, newly transformed, surrounded by a civilization that had spent generations hoping for exactly this outcome, suddenly faced with the reality of what successful communion actually meant for the person at its centre. Whatever celebration her people may have offered in that moment, if any was offered at all, it likely came paired with a dawning understanding, on her part or theirs, that what they had achieved together could not simply be folded back into ordinary life. Something had changed permanently, and there was no path back to who or what she had been before, and perhaps that is the truest way to understand this moment before we step away for a short break in tonight's story. Not as a single dramatic instant of transformation, but as the beginning of a long, slow unravelling, the first night of a change that would continue reshaping her for years, then decades, then centuries, long after anyone who witnessed the original communion had themselves passed into history. Whatever Pthumeru celebrated that night, they were celebrating only the very beginning of something that none of them, not even their queen, could have understood the full shape of yet. We'll carry that thought with us as we move into Mergo's story next, and into everything that followed in the long, quiet centuries after. Before we continue into the next chapter, I want to take just a moment to say thank you for spending part of your evening here with Nightfall Lore. If you're enjoying this journey through Queen Yharnam's story, please consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep making long videos like this one. Alright, let's go back down into the dark. Few names in Bloodborne's lore carry as much quiet devastation as Mergo. Unlike Queen Yharnam, whose story is buried in obscure boss encounters and scattered item text, Mergo's presence is felt directly by every hunter who reaches the game's late content, not through dialogue or direct confrontation, but through sound. The hunter's nightmare, one of the final and most haunting areas in the game, is filled with the unmistakable cries of an infant, audible long before any hunter understands what, or who, they're hearing, or why an entire area seems built around protecting that sound from intrusion. If the theory connecting Queen Yharnam to a Great One holds, as the previous chapter laid out, then Mergo is very likely the result of that communion, a child born not from an ordinary union, but from contact between a human queen and a being whose nature exists almost entirely outside human comprehension. This would make Mergo something genuinely unprecedented even within Bloodborne's already strange cosmology, not fully human, not fully a Great One, but something suspended permanently between those two categories, an infant whose very existence represents the most literal possible consequence of Pthumeru's ancient ambitions. The implications of this are difficult to sit with fully, and the game seems to understand that, choosing to render Mergo's presence almost entirely through implication and sound rather than direct visual confirmation. We hear Mergo, we see the area built around protecting Mergo, we meet the figure who has devoted herself entirely to that protection. But we never see Mergo directly in any conventional sense, and this absence feels deliberate, as though the game itself is unwilling to fully show us a being whose nature sits at such an unsettling intersection of human and incomprehensible. What we do know is that Mergo's birth appears to have been deeply traumatic, in ways that echo far beyond the immediate moment of birth itself. The hunter's nightmare, the area most directly associated with Mergo, is not a place of comfort or care in any traditional sense. It is haunted, twisted, populated by remnants of the very hunters and scholars who once tried to intervene in events connected to Mergo's existence, including, notably, Maria of the Astral Clock Tower and Gehrman himself, both of whom carry connections to this area that suggest they were present for, or deeply affected by, whatever happened around the time of Mergo's birth. A difficult question follows us into the rest of tonight's journey. If Queen Yharnam is Mergo's mother, what happened to separate them? Why is Mergo found in a nightmare realm, seemingly disconnected from the chained queen players eventually encounter at the bottom of the Chalice dungeons? The game does not answer this directly, but the pattern of separation, of mother and child existing in entirely different isolated spaces within the game's structure, suggests something was done, deliberately, likely by the hunters and scholars who first encountered the consequences of Pthumeru's communion, to keep them apart. This is where Mergo's wet nurse enters the story, a figure whose role we will examine more closely in a later chapter, but who represents in many ways the closest thing to an answer the game offers regarding what happened to the relationship between Queen Yharnam and her child. The wet nurse is not Mergo's mother. She is something else entirely, a guardian, possibly assigned or self-appointed, standing watch over a child whose actual mother lies chained and silent in an entirely different layer of the game's buried history. A particular kind of sorrow sits in this configuration, one that lingers as the night deepens around us. A mother transformed beyond recognition by the very act that created her child. A child separated from that mother, guarded instead by a figure whose grief is rendered so viscerally that players who reach the Hunter's Nightmare often describe it as one of the most emotionally affecting moments in the entire game, and between them, an entire civilization's worth of ambition, ritual and consequence, none of which either the mother or the child ever consented to in any meaningful sense. We'll return to Mergo's wet nurse soon, and to the question of what, exactly, happened in the moments after Mergo's birth that led to such complete separation. But first, we need to follow Queen Yharnam's own path forward from communion, into captivity, into the chains we eventually find her in, and into the long centuries of waiting that define her current existence beneath the city that bears her name. Another detail adds further weight to the tragedy of Mergo's isolation. Throughout Bloodborne, the cry of an infant is treated with unusual narrative significance, heard not just within the Hunter's Nightmare, but referenced, obliquely, in other corners of the game's late content, as though the sound itself carries a kind of cosmic weight beyond the immediate scene it's attached to. Some theories suggest Mergo's cries not merely the sound of distress, but something closer to a beacon, a presence capable of drawing attention from beings far beyond the Hunter's Nightmare itself, which would help explain why an entire boss encounter exists specifically to guard against anyone, hunter or otherwise, getting too close. If this reading holds, then Mergo's significance extends even further than being simply the offspring of a transformed queen. The infant may represent an ongoing point of vulnerability for the entire world the game depicts, a living echo of Queen Yharnam's communion, still capable even after all this time of drawing the kind of attention that first transformed his mother centuries earlier. This would explain the desperate, almost frantic energy the wet nurse brings to her defence of the child, fighting not simply to protect an infant from physical harm, but to prevent the recurrence of something that already cost an entire civilization everything once before. It's also worth considering what Mergo's continued existence implies about the nature of communion itself, and whether what happened to Queen Yharnam was ever truly a single, completed event, rather than an ongoing process still unfolding centuries later. If Mergo remains, in some sense, an active conduit capable of drawing attention from beyond ordinary perception, then Queen Yharnam's communion was never simply something that happened to her once and then concluded. It set something in motion that continued independently of her, taking on its own existence, its own vulnerability, its own capacity to shape the world around it long after she herself had been reduced to chains and silence. Mother and child, in this reading, represent two different stages of the same unfinished event, one frozen in captivity, the other still in some quiet and ongoing way, unfolding. We carry that unfinished quality with us now as we follow Queen Yharnam's own path forward, away from the moment of birth and into the long grinding aftermath that defined the rest of her existence. When hunters finally reach Queen Yharnam at the bottom of the Chalice dungeons, the first and most striking detail of her presentation is not her transformed otherworldly aspects, but something far simpler and more human. She is in chains, kneeling, restrained, presented in a posture that reads less like a monarch holding court, and more like a prisoner awaiting an execution that, by the time players arrive, has already been centuries delayed. This detail matters enormously, because it tells us something the rest of her fragmented lore only implies. Whatever happened after her communion with the Great One, whatever transformation overtook her, whatever became of the child born from that contact, at some point someone made the decision to imprison her, not destroy her outright, which would presumably have been simpler if the goal was purely to eliminate a threat. Imprison her, contain her, keep her present, alive in whatever sense applies to a being so thoroughly altered, but rendered powerless and isolated, sealed away at the deepest reachable point of the labyrinth her own civilization once built. Who made this decision, and why, is one of the more difficult questions in Queen Yharnam's story, because the game offers no direct confirmation. But the most plausible explanation, given everything we've established about Pthumeru's collapse and the eventual discovery of the old blood, points toward the Byrgenwerth scholars, the same figures who found the Pthumerian ruins, harvested the blood that would define Yharnam's entire civilization, and very likely encountered Queen Yharnam herself during that initial exploration. If this is accurate, then her chains represent something deeply troubling about the foundation of everything Yharnam the city would eventually become. The scholars who found her did not free her, did not attempt to understand or ease whatever had happened to her as a result of communion with the Great One. They contained her, treated her, in effect, as a resource to be carefully managed rather than a person, however transformed, deserving of any consideration beyond what could be extracted from her continued controlled existence. This framing recontextualizes the entire relationship between the city above and the queen beneath it. Yharnam is not simply named after a historical figure from a civilization that happened to precede it. Yharnam may be, in the most literal sense the game's lore allows, built on top of an ongoing act of captivity, a city whose medicine, whose religious practices, whose very founding resources trace back to a queen who was never freed, never honoured in any meaningful sense, but instead kept chained and contained at the absolute bottom of a labyrinth specifically so that whatever made her valuable could continue to be drawn from her, generation after generation, while the city above forgot she had ever been anything other than a name. A bitter irony sits at the centre of this. A queen, once at the centre of her civilization's defining ambitions, reduced to a contained resource by the very scholars who built an entirely new civilization on top of what they took from her. The chains are not incidental set dressing for a boss encounter. They are in a very real sense the truest physical representation of what the relationship between Yharnam the city and Yharnam the queen actually became. Extraction without consent, continued for so long that the act of containment itself eventually faded from memory, leaving behind only a name on a map and a queen who's been waiting, alone, in the dark, for longer than anyone currently living in the streets above could possibly imagine. It's fair to ask, as we move deeper into this story, what waiting like that does to a being already transformed beyond ordinary human experience. Centuries of isolation, centuries of chains, centuries of knowing, perhaps, that the very city thriving above her existed entirely because of what was taken from her in that initial discovery. Whatever Queen Yharnam was when Byrgenwerth scholars first found her, the version hunters eventually encounter at the bottom of the Chalice dungeons has had a very long time to become something else entirely, not through further transformation in the way communion changed her, but through the slow, grinding weight of captivity itself, stretched out across more time than the game ever fully specifies, but which every detail of her presentation suggests has been agonizingly long. A particular cruelty lives in the specific method of her containment. Chains, by their nature, are not designed simply to prevent escape. They are designed to communicate something about the relationship between the one who holds them and the one who wears them. A constant physical reminder of powerlessness, applied not once but continuously, every moment of every day across an unimaginable span of time. Whoever chose chains as the method of containing Queen Yharnam, rather than some less degrading form of restraint, made a choice that speaks volumes about how she came to be regarded by the civilization that imprisoned her. Not as a fallen monarch deserving of whatever dignity remained available to her circumstances, but as something closer to livestock, restrained by the most basic and humiliating means available, because nobody involved in her captivity considered her dignity worth preserving. This detail becomes even harder to sit with when held alongside everything we've already established about her origins. A queen who once ruled a civilization devoted entirely to the pursuit she eventually undertook, reduced across centuries to a chained figure in a forgotten chamber, her transformation treated not as a subject worthy of careful study and respect, but as a resource to be carefully managed through the crudest possible means. The Healing Church built cathedrals, statues, elaborate rituals of remembrance for figures far less significant to the city's founding than she was. For her they built chains, and then, eventually, stopped building anything at all. Think too about the practical logistics of maintaining a captivity across the kind of time span we're discussing here, because even chains require some degree of upkeep to remain functional across centuries. Stone erodes, metal corrodes. Whatever bound Queen Yharnam in place would have needed at least occasional reinforcement, suggesting that even amid centuries of apparent neglect, someone, somewhere within the church's hierarchy, maintained enough institutional memory to ensure her containment never lapsed entirely. This detail complicates the picture of pure forgetting we've been building. It suggests instead a strange contradictory relationship, a civilization capable of forgetting almost everything meaningful about who she was and why she mattered, while somehow never forgetting the one practical detail that mattered most to their own continued benefit: that she needed to stay exactly where she was, contained, available, and silent. That contradiction, more than almost anything else in her story, captures something essential about how institutions treat what they depend on. Genuine understanding can fade entirely. Genuine care can disappear without anyone noticing it's gone. But the mechanics of extraction, once established, have a way of persisting long after everything else has been forgotten, maintained not out of malice exactly, but out of a kind of institutional inertia that simply never questions why the maintenance continues, only that it must. If Queen Yharnam's captivity forms the foundation beneath the city that bears her name, then the Healing Church's silence regarding her existence represents one of the more troubling aspects of how that foundation has been maintained across generations. The Church, for all its elaborate theology, its blood ministration, its vast architecture and influence over nearly every aspect of Yharnam's civic life, never once publicly acknowledges the Queen whose communion with a Great One arguably made the entire institution possible in the first place. This silence is not simply an oversight. Given how thoroughly the Church controls information, ritual and public understanding throughout Yharnam, the absence of any acknowledgement of Queen Yharnam reads as deliberate, a kind of institutional forgetting, maintained generation after generation, that serves the Church's interests precisely because it prevents anyone from asking uncomfortable questions about where the old blood actually came from, and at what cost it continues to be harvested. Imagine what full public knowledge of Queen Yharnam's existence would mean for the Church's authority. If the citizens of Yharnam understood that their medicine, their religion, the very blood ministration that defines so much of their relationship to the Church, traces back to a captive queen transformed by contact with a Great One, and held in chains beneath their city for centuries without consent, the moral foundation of the entire institution would become impossible to ignore. The Church's authority depends, in large part, on presenting blood ministration as a gift, a sacred technology developed through scholarly achievement rather than extracted continuously from an imprisoned being who never agreed to any of it. This pattern of institutional silence around uncomfortable origins recurs throughout Bloodborne's broader lore, and Queen Yharnam represents perhaps its most extreme example. the Church similarly obscures the true nature of the Old Blood's connection to the Great Ones from ordinary citizens, similarly maintains careful control over who has access to deeper truths about Bergenwerth's discoveries, similarly cultivates a public narrative of medical and spiritual progress that conveniently omits the more disturbing realities underlying that progress. Queen Yharnam's erasure from public memory is not an isolated act of forgetting. It is consistent with how the Church has always managed inconvenient truths, not through destruction of evidence, which would risk discovery, but through careful, sustained silence, maintained across generations until the truth becomes so deeply buried that even asking the right questions becomes nearly impossible for anyone without access to the deepest layers of Church knowledge or the chalice dungeons themselves. An uncomfortable question about complicity follows from this. How many generations of Church scholars have known about Queen Yharnam in some capacity and chosen silence rather than disclosure? How much of the Church's elaborate theological framework, its emphasis on evolution, on transcendence, on the pursuit of higher understanding through blood, exists in part to provide spiritual justification for an act of ongoing extraction that, stripped of theological framing, would simply be recognised as captivity and exploitation of a being who never consented to any of it? The deeper we go into Queen Yharnam's story, the more her captivity starts to feel less like an isolated historical incident and more like the suppressed founding trauma of an entire civilization, something everyone above her, consciously or not, has built their lives on top of, while collectively agreeing, across centuries, never to look too closely at what exactly lies beneath their feet. The city sleeps soundly most nights, its citizens going about their lives never once thinking of a chained queen in the dark below them. Whether that peace is built on genuine ignorance or careful institutional forgetting is a question the game leaves for us to sit with, long after the credits roll and the streets above fall quiet once more. This silence likely shaped the Church's own internal hierarchy over time too. Knowledge of Queen Yharnam's true nature, if it survived at all beyond the earliest generation of Bergenwerth scholars, would almost certainly have become one of the most closely guarded secrets within the Church's upper ranks, a piece of foundational knowledge restricted to only the highest tiers of leadership, doled out, if at all, as a mark of trust and advancement rather than something openly taught. This would help explain why even relatively senior figures within the Church's surface-level operations, the kind of clergy and scholars hunters encounter throughout the main story, seem to carry no apparent awareness of her existence. The truth was never meant to spread beyond a small, carefully controlled circle, and over centuries that circle likely narrowed further still, until perhaps only a handful of individuals across any given generation held any genuine understanding of what their entire civilization owed to a queen. Most of them would never know to ask about. This kind of compartmentalised secrecy carries its own quiet danger, one the game seems to gesture toward without stating directly. Knowledge that survives only within a narrowing circle of trusted leadership is knowledge that can be lost entirely or distorted beyond recognition within just a few generations of carelessness or upheaval. It's entirely possible that by the time hunters encounter Queen Yharnam at the bottom of the chalice dungeons, even the Church's most senior scholars no longer possess accurate knowledge of who she truly was or why she had been imprisoned in the first place, leaving her, in the most literal sense, forgotten not just by the city at large, but even by the very institution that continues to depend on what was taken from her. A final irony closes out this chapter. An institution built almost entirely around the pursuit and preservation of knowledge, devoted to scholarship, to insight, to understanding the deepest truths the world has to offer, may well have lost track of the single most foundational truth underlying its own existence. The healing church spent centuries chasing evolution, transcendence, communion with the Great Ones, all while the original source of everything that made those pursuits possible sat forgotten beneath their own cathedrals, gathering dust, gathering silence, slowly fading even from the memory of the people who owed her everything. Knowledge, it turns out, is not always preserved simply because an institution values it. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones nobody thought to keep asking about year after year, until there was no one left who remembered to ask at all. The Hunter's Nightmare stands apart from nearly every other area in Bloodborne, both in tone and in what it ultimately represents within the game's broader story. Unlike the streets of Yharnam, shaped by the immediate crisis of the hunt, or the Chalice dungeons shaped by ancient Pthumerian ritual, the Hunter's Nightmare feels like a space built entirely around grief, specifically the grief of hunters who failed to protect something and have been trapped, seemingly eternally, reliving that failure. At the heart of this area is Mergo, the infant whose cries we discussed earlier, and whose existence, if our earlier theory holds, represents the literal offspring of Queen Yharnam's communion with the Great One. Mergo is never seen directly, but is felt everywhere throughout this area, protected fiercely by a figure known as Mergo's Wet Nurse, one of the most striking and emotionally complex boss encounters in the entire game. The Wet Nurse's design alone tells us a great deal about her role and the weight of what she's guarding. She appears veiled, sorrowful, wielding twin blades with a fighting style that feels less like aggression and more like desperate, grief-stricken defense. Every aspect of her presentation suggests a being who's been protecting Mergo for a very long time, possibly since shortly after Mergo's birth, standing as the closest thing to a maternal presence the infant has ever known, not because the Wet Nurse is Mergo's actual mother, but because Mergo's actual mother is chained, transformed and isolated at the bottom of an entirely different labyrinth, unable to fulfill that role herself. This separation between Queen Yharnam and Mergo raises one of the more painful questions in this entire story. Was the separation a deliberate act, carried out by hunters or scholars who believed mother and child needed to be kept apart for reasons of safety or control? Or did it happen as a more direct consequence of Queen Yharnam's captivity? A queen rendered physically incapable of caring for her own child the moment she was chained and contained at the depths of Pthumeru's ruins, leaving Mergo to be found, or perhaps deliberately taken, by whoever eventually became the Wet Nurse. The game does not give us a clean answer, but the emotional weight of the hunter's nightmare suggests the truth, whatever its exact mechanics, was deeply traumatic for everyone involved. This is reinforced by the presence of other familiar figures within this nightmare realm. Gehrman, the first hunter, exists here in some capacity, alongside Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, both of whom carry strong implications of having been present for, or deeply affected by, the events surrounding Mergo's birth and the broader crisis it triggered. Their presence here, trapped within this grief-soaked nightmare alongside the Wet Nurse and the unseen infant she protects, suggests that whatever happened around the time of Mergo's birth was significant enough to leave permanent marks on some of the most capable hunters in the game's entire history. Something quietly devastating sits in recognizing that the Wet Nurse, for all her fierce protectiveness, is not guarding Mergo out of any biological connection. She's taken on a role that should have belonged to Queen Yharnam, doing so not out of obligation, but seemingly out of genuine sustained devotion, maintained across what the game implies has been an extraordinarily long span of time. In a story already filled with figures transformed and separated by forces beyond their control, The wet nurse represents something slightly different, a being who chose to step into an absence and fill it as best she could, even knowing perhaps that she could never truly replace what Mergo had lost. When hunters eventually defeat the wet nurse and end this particular nightmare, the implications are not triumphant in any straightforward sense. It means the end of whatever protection Mergo had left. It means the final severing of even the substitute, makeshift care that had been holding this small, broken family structure together in some form, however imperfect, across however many years had passed since Queen Yharnam was first chained and Mergo was first separated from her. The hunter's nightmare in this light is not simply another obstacle to overcome on the path to the game's true ending. It is the final chapter of a separation that began far below, in a chamber where a queen still kneels in, chains, unable to do anything but wait. There's also the question of where exactly the hunter's nightmare exists in relation to the rest of the game's geography, worth sitting with for a moment. Unlike the Chalice dungeons, which represent literal physical depths beneath Yharnam streets, the nightmare occupies a stranger, more liminal kind of space. Not quite a location in any conventional sense, but something closer to a dream or a memory given enough weight and consequence to become traversable. This distinction matters for understanding Mergo's situation specifically. If the nightmare is not a physical place in the way the Chalice dungeons are, then Mergo's separation from Queen Yharnam may not be simply geographic. It may be ontological, mother and child existing quite literally in different categories of reality altogether, one bound by chains in the waking world's deepest layers, the other suspended somewhere closer to dream, guarded by a figure who herself may not be entirely of the waking world either. This would help explain why no hunter, however dedicated, has ever managed to reunite them, why no questline or item description ever suggests the possibility of bringing mother and child back together. They may not simply be far apart, they may exist by the time players encounter either of them in forms of being that cannot meaningfully occupy the same space at all. Queen Yharnam transformed by communion into something tied permanently to the physical depth of Pthumeru, Mergo existing instead within whatever strange dream logic governs the nightmare itself. The two of them separated not by distance alone, but by the fundamental nature of what each of them became in the aftermath of that single, world-altering act of communion. One final thought stays with us before we leave the hunter's nightmare behind for tonight. Despite everything separating them, despite the impossibility of any conventional reunion, the game still places Mergo's cries within earshot of figures connected to Queen Yharnam's broader story. Gehrman, Maria, the wet nurse herself, all of them existing within proximity of that sound, even if none of them can do anything to ease its source. It's an almost unbearably poignant arrangement. The infant's distress remains audible, persistent, woven into the very fabric of this nightmare space, as though some part of this story refuses to let itself be fully silenced, even when every conventional avenue toward resolution has been closed off entirely. Mergo cries, and the cry continues, century after century, a small unbroken thread connecting a mother who cannot reach a child to a guardian who can never fully replace her. Within a space the game itself seems to understand can never offer anything resembling a happy ending, only the quiet, ongoing fact of grief persisting. With that thread still hanging in the air, we leave the nightmare behind and return, finally, to the chamber where this all began. For most hunters, the encounter with Queen Yharnam herself comes only after extensive optional exploration of the Chalice dungeons, accessed through specific root Chalice configurations that require considerable dedication to reach. This obscurity is itself meaningful. The game seems to deliberately position this confrontation as something only the most committed players will ever witness. mirroring, in a strange way, how thoroughly her existence has been buried by the civilization built above her. The encounter itself unfolds in distinct phases, each revealing more about the layered nature of what Queen Yharnam has become since her communion with the Great One and her subsequent captivity. In her initial phase, she presents largely as a chained, kneeling figure, diminished, restrained, almost passive in her positioning, a far cry from any conventional image of monarchy or threat. This initial presentation reinforces everything we've discussed about her captivity, rendering visually the centuries of containment that define her current existence. As the fight progresses, however, this restrained presentation gives way to something far stranger. Small, spider-like creatures begin to emerge from her form, unsettling, otherworldly, suggesting that whatever exists within her, the result of her communion with the Great One, is not fully contained even by the chains meant to restrain her. These creatures feel less like separate enemies summoned to her aid and more like fragments of her own transformed nature, manifesting outward in ways that blur the line between Queen Yharnam as an individual being and Queen Yharnam as a vessel for something far larger and more incomprehensible than any single body could fully contain. In her final phase, the fight reveals its most striking transformation. Queen Yharnam's true, fully realised form, shedding the restrained, chained presentation of earlier phases in favour of something that visually confirms everything the game's lore has only implied. This is communion made manifest. This is what centuries of containment have not been able to fully suppress. Whatever Byrgenwerth scholars found and chained at the bottom of Pthumeru's ruins, it was never going to remain simply human, no matter how long the chains held, no matter how thoroughly the church maintained its silence above. What makes this encounter so distinct from many other Bloodborne boss fights is the emotional register it operates in. This is not a battle against pure menace in the way some of the game's beast encounters function, nor is it the tragic confrontation with a once noble figure driven mad, the way certain other boss fights are framed. There is something more ambiguous here, a sense that hunters reaching this chamber are not simply defeating a monster, but participating in the final act of a captivity that has already been going on for far too long. Victory in this fight does not feel like triumph over evil. It feels, more than almost any other encounter in the game, like an ending finally being allowed to happen for someone who's been waiting for one, in some form, for centuries. After her defeat, the game offers a small but significant detail that reinforces this reading. An item connected to her passing that speaks, however briefly, to the truth of what she was and what her death finally represents. The specifics matter less here than the overall tone. This is not framed as the elimination of a threat so much as the long overdue conclusion of a story that began with communion, continued through captivity, and ends, finally, with release of a kind that can only come through death, in a chamber far below a city that never once came down to see her, let alone offer any other way out. Sit with this for a moment before we move forward. So many of Bloodborne's boss encounters ask players to confront tragedy from the outside, observing what became of figures who reached too far or suffered too greatly. Queen Yharnam's encounter asks something slightly different. It asks players to participate directly in ending a suffering that has lasted so long, the ending itself becomes almost more significant than the fight that produces it. Whatever else her story tells us about ambition, communion, and the cost of reaching toward beings beyond human comprehension, her death in this chamber reads less like defeat and more like a release that was, by every indication the game offers, centuries overdue. The sound, design accompanying this encounter deserves a mention too, which many players who have completed it describe as unusually restrained compared to the bombastic, dramatic scores accompanying other major boss fights throughout the game. Where other significant encounters lean into sweeping orchestral intensity, the music surrounding Queen Yharnam's fight carries a quieter, more mournful quality, less interested in heightening tension than in underscoring sorrow. This compositional choice reinforces everything we've discussed about the emotional register of the encounter. It is not built to feel triumphant, and the game's sound design seems determined to make sure players feel that distinction, even if they couldn't articulate exactly why the fight feels different from the moment the first notes begin. This careful, deliberate tonal choice extends to the environment surrounding the fight as well. Unlike grander boss arenas built with elaborate visual spectacle, the chamber housing Queen Yharnam remains relatively simple throughout the encounter, never shifting into the kind of dramatic environmental transformation that marks many of the game's other major confrontations. The space stays quiet, stays contained, stays focused entirely on her, as though the game itself understood that nothing surrounding this particular tragedy needed embellishment. Sometimes the most devastating stories are the ones told with the least visual noise, and Queen Yharnam's final encounter seems built entirely around that principle. One last detail about the rhythm of this particular fight stands out, distinct from the more aggressive, relentless pacing many players associate with Bloodborne's combat as a whole. Queen Yharnam's encounter, by most accounts from players who have completed it, unfolds with unusual patience, offering hunters more space to observe, to absorb, to sit with what they're witnessing, rather than simply reacting on pure reflex the way so much of the game demands elsewhere. Whether intentional or not, this pacing gives the encounter room to breathe as a piece of storytelling rather than purely a mechanical challenge, allowing the weight of everything we've discussed tonight to land more fully in the moments between her attacks, in the brief pauses where a kneeling chained queen and the spider-like fragments of her transformation simply exist in front of you, waiting for whatever comes next. Even after walking through everything we've covered tonight, Queen Yharnam remains by design one of the most genuinely uncertain figures in Bloodborne's entire mythology. The game's deliberate vagueness around her exact nature, her relationship to Mergo, and the precise mechanics of her transformation has led to years of community theorizing, much of it compelling, none of it definitively confirmed. Let's spend some time tonight with a few of the most prominent theories, not to claim any single one as absolute truth, but to appreciate the genuine mystery that makes her story so enduringly fascinating. One persistent theory suggests that Queen Yharnam's communion was not with just any Great One, but specifically with an entity connected to the broader family of beings associated with the moon and lunar imagery that recurs throughout Bloodborne's late-game content. This theory points to visual and thematic similarities between elements of her boss design and other moon-associated entities encountered elsewhere in the game, suggesting a deeper connective thread running through the game's cosmology that ties her fate to forces far beyond Pthumeru alone. If true, this would position her not as an isolated tragic figure, but as one node within a much larger pattern of communion and consequence that spans the entire world of Bloodborne. Another theory focuses on the precise relationship between Queen Yharnam's transformation and the spider-like creatures that emerge during her boss fight, proposing that these are not merely visual flourishes, but represent something closer to fragments of failed or alternate offspring, other potential Mergos, so to speak, that did not survive or fully form, leaving behind only these unsettling remnants that manifest alongside her in battle. This theory adds another layer of tragedy to her story, suggesting that Mergo may not have been the only outcome of her communion, and that whatever process led to Mergo's birth may have been considerably more fraught and considerably more painful than a single successful birth alone would suggest. A third significant theory concerns the timeline of her captivity relative to the founding of Yharnam itself, proposing that her imprisonment did not happen immediately following Byrgenwerth's discovery of Pthumeru, but rather occurred gradually over generations as successive waves of scholars and hunters encountered her, drew further understanding and resources from what they found, and incrementally reinforced her containment as the city above grew more dependent on what that containment provided. This theory reframes her chains not as a single act of imprisonment, but as an accumulation of restraint, layered and reinforced across centuries by an institution that never seriously considered any alternative to continued extraction. There is also considerable community discussion around what her death ultimately means for the broader status of the Old Blood and the Healing Church's blood ministration going forward, whether her passing represents a genuine disruption to the resource the Church has depended on for so long, or whether, given how long the harvesting and ministration practices had already been established by the time hunters reach her, her death changes comparatively little for the city above, which continues largely unaware that anything has happened at all, deep beneath its streets, in a chamber almost none of its citizens will ever know existed. What's striking about engaging with these theories collectively is how consistently they return to the same emotional core, regardless of which specific mechanical details different theorists emphasize. Queen Yharnam, across nearly every interpretation the community has developed, remains fundamentally a tragic figure, someone who reached towards something vast, paid a price far beyond what any reasonable accounting could justify, and was then treated not as a person deserving consideration in the aftermath, but as a resource to be carefully managed and quietly forgotten. The specifics of theory may shift and evolve as players continue dissecting the game's fragmented lore, but the fundamental shape of her tragedy seems remarkably stable across nearly every serious attempt to understand her. There is one further theory worth mentioning here, quieter than the others but no less compelling to those who have spent significant time studying Bloodborne's broader cosmology. Some have proposed that Queen Yharnam's transformation and the existence of Mergo as its result may connect more directly than previously assumed to the game's various endings, particularly the ending in which the player character becomes host to a new Great One entirely. If communion with a Great One can produce offspring, and if the game's endings explore what happens when a hunter undergoes a process not entirely dissimilar to what Queen Yharnam experienced centuries earlier, then her story may function as a kind of dark mirror for what awaits the player character themselves, depending on the choices made throughout the night of the hunt. This reading transforms her from a purely historical figure into something closer to a warning, buried deep enough that only the most dedicated players ever encounter it, about exactly what kind of fate might await anyone foolish or desperate enough to reach as far as she once did. This layering of theory upon theory, none of them definitively confirmed, none of them entirely dismissible, is precisely what makes Queen Yharnam's story so compelling, for a channel built around exploring the quieter corners of this world. She offers no easy answers, no clean resolution, only fragments arranged carefully enough by the game's original designers to suggest a shape without ever fully completing it. That incompleteness is not a flaw in the storytelling. It is in many ways the entire point, a deliberate choice to leave the deepest truths of this world just out of reach, rewarding only the patience and curiosity of players willing to sit with uncertainty rather than demanding resolution. This theorizing process itself mirrors something important about the way Bloodborne's broader cosmology treats knowledge in general, worth acknowledging before we move on. Throughout the game, the pursuit of deeper understanding is consistently portrayed as both irresistible and dangerous, scholars driven mad by insight, hunters transformed by exposure to truths they were never meant to fully grasp, entire institutions built and destroyed by the relentless pull toward knowing more than is safe to know. In a strange way, the community's own ongoing effort to piece together Queen Yharnam's story, sitting here tonight building theory upon theory from fragments she left behind, participates in that same pattern, if only at the safe remove of fiction, rather than the genuine cosmic stakes the game's characters face. We reach toward her truth the way Pthumeru once reached toward the Great Ones. Carefully, persistently, never quite certain we've grasped the whole of what we're looking for, but unable to stop looking all the same. Unlike the scholars and queens within the story itself, though, our own reaching carries no real cost beyond curiosity and a late hour spent thinking about a fictional tragedy instead of sleeping. That's worth remembering as we move forward, that there is a safety in fiction, a gentleness in being able to sit with darkness this deep without it ever actually touching us the way it touched her. We can afford to keep looking, exactly because none of what we find will ever reach far enough to cost us anything at all. As we come to the final chapter of tonight's journey, let's step back from the granular details of communion, captivity, and boss mechanics to consider the larger question her story ultimately raises. What, if anything, does the city of Yharnam owe to the queen whose name it carries, and whose suffering, knowingly or not, made nearly everything about that city's existence possible? This is not a question Bloodborne answers directly, and it's not a question with a clean, satisfying resolution even within the framework of community theory. But it stays with us, because it reframes Queen Yharnam's story from a piece of obscure optional lore into something closer to a moral reckoning the game quietly invites players to undertake on their own, long after the credits have rolled and the streets of Yharnam have gone dark and silent. Look at everything the city built on top of what was taken from her. The Healing Church's entire theological and medical apparatus. The blood ministration that defines so much of ordinary citizens' relationship to faith and healing. The scholarly pursuits of Byrgenwerth that eventually spiralled into the broader crisis of the hunt itself. All of it traces back, link by link, to the discovery of old blood beneath Pthumeru's ruins, and very possibly to Queen Yharnam directly as its origin point. The city does not simply bear her name as an arbitrary historical footnote. It exists in its most fundamental form because of what was extracted from her, continuously, across centuries, without her consent and largely without her even being acknowledged as a person whose consent might have mattered. And yet the city forgot her almost entirely, not through any dramatic act of erasure, but through the quieter, more insidious process of her institutional silence we discussed several chapters ago. Generations of citizens living their entire lives within a civilization built on her suffering, never once required or even encouraged to reckon with that foundation. Because the church that controlled public knowledge had every incentive to keep that foundation buried as deeply as the chambers she herself was chained within. This is, in many ways, the quietest but most devastating aspect of her entire story. It is not simply that she suffered. Suffering alone, however terrible, exists throughout Bloodborne's world in countless forms. What makes Queen Yharnam's story distinct is the combination of that suffering with near total erasure from collective memory. A civilization thriving directly because of what was taken from her, while simultaneously ensuring that almost none of its citizens would ever know enough to ask whether that taking had been right, or whether anything was owed to her in return. When hunters finally reach her at the bottom of the Chalice dungeons and end her long captivity, there is no ceremony, no public acknowledgement, no moment where the city above pauses to recognise what has happened far beneath its streets. Life continues exactly as it did before, citizens going about their business in total ignorance of the Queen, who has just, after centuries of waiting, finally been allowed to stop. This absence of acknowledgement is perhaps the most fitting and most quietly tragic conclusion the game could offer, for a figure whose entire story has been defined by being taken from, used, and forgotten. What does the city owe her? Perhaps nothing it will ever actually pay. Perhaps the honest answer the game offers, beneath all its careful ambiguity, is that some debts simply go unpaid. That civilizations are frequently built on foundations their citizens never examine closely, and that the people who paid the original cost of that foundation are rarely, if ever, given the chance to collect on what's owed to them. Queen Yharnam reached towards something vast, paid for that reaching with everything she had, and asked for nothing in return except, perhaps, an ending. The game, in its own quiet way, finally grants her that much. Whether it's enough is a question worth carrying with you long after tonight's story ends. Let's widen the lens here for a moment, because this pattern of unpaid debt is not unique to Queen Yharnam within Bloodborne's broader world, even if her version of it is the oldest and most foundational. Nearly every significant institution within the game's story is built, in some fashion, on a quiet cost passed down to someone who never consented to paying it. The hunters themselves, bound by contracts to a church that rarely tells them the full truth of what they're hunting or why. The beasts roaming Yharnam's streets, once ordinary citizens transformed by blood ministration, they were told would heal them. Even the choir, pursuing their own ambitions toward the Great Ones, ultimately at the expense of countless lives caught in the crossfire of their experiments. Queen Yharnam's story is the deepest layer of a pattern that repeats, in smaller and larger forms, throughout nearly every level of this world's history. A final, quieter question follows us into the remaining chapters of tonight's story. If civilizations are so often built this way, on costs nobody examines too closely, what does it mean for those of us listening tonight safely outside the fiction to spend this time deliberately examining one of those costs anyway? Perhaps there is something genuinely worthwhile in the act itself, not because it changes anything within the story, which remains fixed regardless of how closely we look, but because the practice of looking closely, of refusing easy forgetting, of insisting that even fictional queens chained at the bottom of fictional labyrinths deserve to have their stories told carefully and completely, says something about the kind of attention we choose to bring to the real world as well. A quieter comfort lives in this too, one worth carrying with you as we move into the final stretch of tonight's journey. Stories like this one exist, in part, because someone, somewhere, decided that even buried, optional, easily missed tragedies deserve careful telling. From Software could have left Queen Yharnam as nothing more than a difficult boss fight and a strange name with no explanation. Instead, they scattered just enough fragments to make her discoverable, to reward exactly the kind of patient, careful attention we've spent tonight bringing to her story. That choice, small as it might seem against the scale of everything she suffered within the fiction, still matters. It means her story was never meant to disappear entirely. It was only ever waiting for someone willing to go looking. Tonight, we kept looking. One of the more unsettling realizations that emerges once you understand Queen Yharnam's story is how directly it seems to repeat itself, centuries later, in the actions of the Healing Church's most extreme faction, the choir and the scholars of Mensis who eventually splintered from it. Their late-game ritual, conducted in the Nightmare of Mensis, and built around an enormous eyeless effigy, meant to draw the attention of a Great One, mirrors Pthumeru's original ambitions so closely that it's difficult to read it as coincidence. It reads, instead, like an echo, a civilization's deepest mistake being relearned, generation after generation, by people who never had access to the buried truth of what that mistake had already cost. The Mensis ritual, for those unfamiliar with its specifics, was an attempt by a desperate faction of scholars to draw down a Great One directly, hoping that communion would grant them transcendence, evolution, escape from the limits of ordinary human cognition. They built their ritual around what the game refers to as the One Reborn, an enormous infant-like effigy constructed specifically to attract a Great One's attention by mimicking the presence of an actual offspring. This detail alone should give us pause. If our reading of Queen Yharnam's story holds, the Mensis scholars were not improvising a new technique. They were, consciously or not, attempting to recreate the exact circumstances that had once produced Mergo, using an artificial infant in place of an actual queen, hoping to draw the same kind of attention that had once transformed a Pthumerian ruler centuries earlier. The fact that they needed to construct an effigy at all is itself telling. They did not have access to a queen capable of genuine communion. They did not, it seems, have any direct understanding of what had actually happened to Queen Yharnam, or how her transformation had truly occurred. They were working from incomplete knowledge, perhaps fragments recovered from Byrgenwerth's early explorations of the Pthumerian ruins, attempting to reverse engineer a process whose true mechanics had been lost, buried, or deliberately withheld by whichever scholars first encountered her and chose silence over disclosure. This positions Queen Yharnam's story not as an isolated historical incident, safely contained within the ancient past of a vanished civilization, but as the origin point of a pattern that the healing church itself would eventually, catastrophically repeat. The Mensis ritual ends in disaster. A Great One does respond, but not in the way the scholars hoped, and the consequences ripple outward across the entire city, contributing directly to the broader crisis players experience throughout the main story. In this light, Queen Yharnam is not simply a tragic figure from the distant past. She is the first instance of a mistake that the city built in her name would go on to make again, with even less understanding and even less control centuries later. A particular kind of grim irony emerges in recognizing that the scholars who eventually attempted the Mensis ritual were, in some sense, her own intellectual descendants, inheritors of a civilization built on the resource extracted from her captivity, attempting to recreate the very communion that had cost her everything, without ever understanding, or perhaps caring to understand, what that communion had actually done to the person who first experienced it. They wanted the power. They did not want, or did not think to ask about, the cost. This pattern of repetition without understanding feels, the more you sit with it, like one of the quieter but more devastating themes running through all of Bloodborne's buried history. Civilizations rarely seem to learn from their own foundational traumas in this world. They build on top of them instead, generation after generation, until the original event is so thoroughly buried beneath layers of new ambition that nobody remaining has any real sense of what they're actually risking by reaching for the same thing all over again. A further layer of irony shows up in how the Mensis ritual ultimately unfolds. The effigy they construct, the artificial infant meant to draw a Great One's attention, succeeds in its goal, but the entity that responds, often interpreted by the community as being connected to the moon presence, or a similarly vast cosmic force, does not behave the way the scholars hoped or anticipated. Whatever happened during Queen Yharnam's original communion centuries earlier However the Pthumerians managed to achieve whatever measure of success they achieved, the Mensis scholars clearly lacked something essential to replicate it safely. Perhaps it was specific ritual knowledge lost along with the rest of Pthumerian civilization. Perhaps it was something more fundamental about Queen Yharnam herself, some quality or circumstance unique to her that the Mensis scholars, working from an artificial substitute, could never hope to reproduce no matter how carefully they constructed their effigy. This gap between Pthumeru's original success and Mensis's eventual catastrophe suggests something important about how we should understand Queen Yharnam's place in this story. She was not simply unlucky, caught up in a process that would have gone badly for anyone who attempted it. She, or her civilization working alongside her, achieved something the much more advanced, much more scientifically sophisticated healing church centuries later could not safely replicate even with all of Byrgenwerth's accumulated knowledge behind them. Whatever Queen Yharnam was, whatever made her communion possible in a way the Mensis ritual's artificial substitute never could be, it speaks to a kind of significance that the game never fully explains, but consistently implies through every failed attempt to recreate what she alone seems to have achieved. An uncomfortable possibility surfaces as we close this chapter, that the Mensis scholars, in their desperation, may have actually understood at least part of what made Queen Yharnam's communion possible, and simply lacked access to the one thing they couldn't manufacture or substitute: an actual queen, willing or otherwise capable of carrying a connection to a great one the way she once did. If true, this would mean the Mensis ritual's use of an artificial infant effigy wasn't merely a crude approximation born of ignorance, but a desperate workaround for a problem they understood perfectly well. That what Pthumeru had centuries before was not a technique that could be taught or replicated through scholarship alone, but a person, with everything irreplaceable that implies. In trying to substitute an effigy for a queen, the Mensis scholars may have been unknowingly paying the strangest, most distorted kind of tribute imaginable to the woman whose suffering had made their entire civilization possible in the first place. Acknowledging, however unintentionally, that what she once provided could never truly be replaced by anything they were capable of constructing. Let's take a slower, more deliberate look at the chamber itself, the specific space deep within the Chalice dungeons where Queen Yharnam is eventually found, because the architecture surrounding her tells its own quiet story, independent of any item description or boss dialogue. Unlike many of Bloodborne's other significant locations, which tend to be elaborately decorated, layered with statues, candles, and visual markers of reverence or dread, the chamber housing Queen Yharnam is comparatively sparse. Stone, chains, a throne-like structure that feels less like a seat of honour and more like a fixed point designed to keep her exactly where her captors intended her to remain. This sparseness matters. Throughout Bloodborne, elaborate architecture tends to signal active devotion. Cathedrals built and maintained because people still worship within them. Statues kept upright because someone still tends to their presence. Queen Yharnam's chamber offers none of this ongoing care. It feels frozen, abandoned in everything except its central function of containment, as though whoever built it constructed exactly what was needed to keep her restrained and then simply stopped, leaving the space to gather dust and silence for however many centuries followed. One plausible reading here: the simplicity of her prison reflects how quickly even active oppression can curdle into pure neglect. The scholars who first chained her may have done so with at least some active engagement, visiting, drawing blood, studying whatever she had become. But as generations passed, as the healing church grew more elaborate and more removed from its founding discoveries, the actual maintenance of her captivity likely became rote, then infrequent, then perhaps almost entirely unattended. the chains themselves doing the work that no living scholar particularly wanted to oversee directly anymore. She may have spent centuries not just imprisoned, but functionally alone, visited only rarely, if at all, by a civilization that needed what she provided, but had long since stopped wanting to look at her directly while taking it. The labyrinthine path required to reach her reinforces this reading. Unlike a prison built for easy access by jailers who need to regularly check on their prisoner, the chalice dungeon structure surrounding Queen Yharnam's chamber is deliberately obscure, randomized in its generation, requiring specific ritual materials and considerable effort to even reach. This is not the architecture of active control. It is the architecture of burial, a space designed not for ongoing management, but for permanent, deliberate forgetting, with just enough structural integrity maintained to ensure she could never escape, even as everyone responsible for putting her there gradually stopped coming to check. Something almost unbearably lonely lives in this image once you sit with it fully. A queen, transformed by communion with something vast, chained not in a place of careful study or even cruel attention, but in a space built specifically to be forgotten, visited perhaps only by the rare scholar seeking blood for ministration, otherwise left entirely to the dark and the silence for what the game's environmental storytelling suggests has been an extraordinarily long time. The hunters who eventually find her are not simply ending a captivity. They are very likely the first living beings to enter that specific chamber in longer than anyone could reasonably estimate, breaking a silence so complete that her transformation itself, by the time they arrive, has had centuries to deepen entirely undisturbed. What might this kind of prolonged isolation mean for whatever consciousness remained within her by the time hunters finally arrive? The game offers no dialogue from Queen Yharnam, no moment of recognition or communication during the encounter, only silence punctuated by combat. This absence of voice could simply reflect the limitations of her transformed state, a being no longer capable of the kind of communication that defined her before communion. But it could also reflect something more devastating still. Centuries of isolation so complete that whatever remained of her original self had long since retreated. Somewhere the chains and the silence could never quite reach, leaving behind only the physical shell hunters eventually encounter, still bound, still waiting, but no longer entirely present in any way that could recognize or respond to the visitors finally arriving after so long. Either reading carries its own particular weight. If some fragment of awareness persisted throughout her captivity, then the centuries of silence represent a form of suffering almost too vast to fully comprehend. A consciousness trapped within stone and chains, aware enough to register the passage of time, but powerless to do anything except wait. If no such awareness persisted, if whatever made her recognizably herself faded long before hunters ever arrived, then her eventual defeat carries a different kind of sorrow entirely. Not the relief of a suffering mind finally released, but the quiet tragedy of a death that came centuries too late to matter to whoever she had actually been before the chains, before the silence, before the slow architecture of forgetting closed in around her completely. Whichever reading feels truer to you, carry both possibilities forward into the rest of tonight's story, because the game itself never forces a single answer. That ambiguity is not a gap in the storytelling. It is, in its own quiet way, part of the tragedy. A queen whose final true experience remains as unknowable to us as it likely became to the very civilization that once depended on her. We carry that uncertainty with us now, gently, as we turn to look at the other women whose stories echo hers across this world. Queen Yharnam's story becomes even more resonant when placed alongside the other women in Bloodborne's world who occupy positions of authority or significance, because the pattern that defines her fate, power followed by transformation, transformation followed by isolation, recurs in varied forms throughout much of the game's broader cast. Understanding these parallels helps clarify just how consistently Bloodborne returns to this particular shape of tragedy, suggesting it reflects something the game's writers considered central to its entire vision of what reaching toward transcendence ultimately costs. Consider Annalise, the Queen of Cainhurst, ruler of the vile blood bloodline players encounter in the game's optional Cainhurst Castle content. Annalise, like Queen Yharnam, holds genuine authority within her own domain, yet her story is similarly defined by isolation, ambition, and a willingness to use deeply uncomfortable means. In her case, accepting the cold blood of the vile bloods in hopes of producing an heir of unusual power, to pursue ends that place her at odds with the broader forces of Yharnam's civilization. Both queens, separated by bloodline and circumstance, are defined fundamentally by motherhood pursued through transformation, and both ultimately exist as isolated figures, encountered by hunters only after years or centuries of solitary waiting within architecture built explicitly to keep them separate from the world they once ruled. Maria of the Astral Clock Tower offers another point of comparison, though her path diverges in important ways. Unlike Queen Yharnam, Maria's isolation is self-imposed, a choice made in response to guilt over the fishing hamlet massacre rather than captivity forced upon her by others. Yet she too ends her story isolated within a tower, removed from the broader world, carrying knowledge and trauma connected to communion with forces beyond ordinary human understanding. Her presence within the hunter's nightmare, the same area haunted by Mergo's cries, suggests her story, and Queen Yharnam's may intersect more directly than the game ever fully confirms. Perhaps Maria was present for, or peripherally involved in, the events surrounding Mergo's birth, her guilt over fishing hamlet compounding with whatever she witnessed or failed to prevent regarding Queen Yharnam's fate. Even Yosefka, physician players encounter throughout the main story, fits loosely into this broader pattern. A woman whose pursuit of medical and scientific advancement leads her toward experimentation with beings and substances she does not fully understand, ultimately resulting in her own transformation into something no longer recognizably human, isolated within her clinic, attended to or avoided by hunters depending on the choices made throughout a given playthrough. The specifics differ considerably from Queen Yharnam's story, but the underlying shape, ambition, transformation, isolation, echoes clearly enough to suggest a deliberate pattern rather than coincidence. What does it mean that so many of Bloodborne's most significant female figures share this particular arc? Without overstating any single interpretation, the game seems consistently interested in exploring how ambition and transformation intersect with motherhood, isolation, and care. Themes that recur far more often among its female characters than its male ones, who tend instead toward different patterns of obsession, often centered on scholarship, hunting, or institutional power, rather than transformation through communion and birth specifically. Queen Yharnam, in this light, stands not as an isolated curiosity buried at the bottom of an obscure dungeon, but as perhaps the oldest and most foundational example of a pattern the game returns to again and again, each time finding new, equally devastating ways to explore what it costs a woman to reach towards something vast, and what is taken from her afterward by a world that benefits from that reaching without ever fully reckoning with its price. There's one more figure worth mentioning briefly in this comparison, even though her connection to this particular pattern is more tenuous than the others. The plain doll, the quiet caretaker hunters encounter repeatedly throughout the hunter's dream. The doll's exact origins remain deliberately ambiguous throughout the game, with some interpretation suggesting she was modelled after a specific woman Gehrman once cared for, possibly even connected, in some indirect way, to the broader network of transformation and loss running through this story. Whether or not the doll connects directly to Queen Yharnam's narrative, her presence as a figure of care and stability within the hunter's dream offers a quiet counterpoint to everything we've explored tonight. A reminder that even within a world this consistently devastating toward its women, the game still makes space for figures of genuine tenderness, however small, however limited their power to change the larger patterns surrounding them. Taken together, these parallel stories paint a picture of Bloodborne's world that's worth holding on to as we move toward tonight's conclusion. This is not a world that simply happened to produce one tragic queen, isolated and easily forgotten. It is a world built, again and again, on the foundation of women who reached toward something larger than themselves, paid devastating costs for that reaching, and were then left largely alone to carry the consequences, while the civilizations around them moved forward, built new institutions, told new stories, and rarely paused long enough to ask what exactly had been sacrificed to make any of it possible. And yet, for all that shared shape of suffering, each of these women remains distinct, irreducible to a single pattern, even as they echo one another across the game's history. Annalise rules still, isolated but undefeated, her story ongoing rather than concluded. Maria chose her isolation, carrying guilt that was, at least in part, her own to carry. Iosefka's transformation came through scientific ambition rather than inherited civilizational purpose. Queen Yharnam alone stands at the absolute origin point of this pattern, predating every other example by centuries. Her story not simply one tragedy among several, but the deep root from which so many of the others seem to have grown, whether the game's designers intended that connective thread explicitly or simply found themselves, generation of storytelling after generation of storytelling drawn back toward the same essential shape of loss. We end tonight where we began, with a name. Yharnam, carried by an entire city across centuries, spoken by citizens who will likely never learn where it truly came from, attached to streets and cathedrals and a healing church that built its entire authority on a foundation it has worked very hard to keep hidden. Beneath all of that, in a chamber few will ever reach, a queen who reached towards something incomprehensible, paid for that reaching with her freedom, her transformation, and her separation from a child she may never have been allowed to properly hold, finally found her ending in the hands of hunters who likely understood, at best, only a fraction of what they were truly bringing to a close. There is something fitting about closing a story like this one at the end of a long, quiet night. Queen Yharnam waited in the dark for what the game implies was an extraordinarily long time, chained and largely forgotten, while the world above her moved on entirely unaware. Perhaps there is some small comfort in knowing her story. Even now, even this far removed from the events themselves, is still being told, still being carried forward by people willing to sit with the discomfort of what it asks us to consider about the foundations beneath the places we call home. If tonight's journey through her story gave you something to think about as you drift towards sleep, I'm grateful you spent this time with Nightfall lore. There's more of Yharnam's buried history still waiting to be uncovered in future videos. More names beneath more streets, more queens and scholars and forgotten figures whose story shaped a city that has, across its long and troubled history, rarely been kind to the people who built it. Think, for a moment, about everything we've walked through together tonight. A civilization that reached toward the incomprehensible and was undone by what answered. A queen who carried that reaching in her own transformed body for longer than any single life should ever have to bear. A child separated from his mother by forces neither of them ever consented to, guarded instead by a grieving substitute who gave him whatever fragments of care she could offer. A city built entirely on top of all of it, thriving for centuries while remaining almost completely unaware of the cost beneath its own foundations. These are not small things to carry into sleep, but perhaps that's exactly what makes a story like this one worth telling slowly, carefully, the way we've tried to tell it tonight. Not to disturb your rest, but to give the weight of it somewhere honest to settle before the night fully takes you. A particular kind of peace comes, I think, from finally understanding a story this thoroughly buried. Not the peace of resolution, because Queen Yharnam's story never truly resolves in any clean or satisfying sense, but the peace of attention, of having looked closely at something the world around her chose for centuries not to look at all. Whatever else her story means, whatever theories continue to circulate and evolve as players keep returning to her chamber at the bottom of the Chalice dungeons, she is no longer entirely forgotten. Tonight at least, someone was listening. Carry that thought with you as the night deepens further. Somewhere in a fictional city built on cobblestones and old blood, a chamber sits empty now, its chains finally still. Somewhere in a nightmare realm built from grief, an infant's cries, whatever became of them, are no longer quite so alone in the dark. None of it changes anything about the world you'll wake into tomorrow, but perhaps it changes just slightly. The quality of attention you bring to the quieter, more buried corners of the stories around you, fictional or otherwise. For now, though, let the chains fall quiet. Let the chamber beneath the city finally rest empty. Let Mergo's cries, wherever they echo now, finally find some measure of peace. Sleep now, beneath the city that never knew her name. The Queen has finally been allowed to rest.